There comes a moment in life when you realize you've lost everything that once defined you. For Eric Vance, that moment came at 50, standing in an empty driveway with nothing but a truck and the weight of failure pressing down on his chest. His house was gone. His savings were gone. His grown daughter lived her own life 3 states away. So he drove into the forests of northern Wyoming and built a simple treehouse from salvaged wood. It wasn't much, just a place to survive the winter and think things through. But on his 3rd morning there, something unexpected happened. He looked down from the platform and saw 3 grey wolves standing in the clearing below, watching him quietly. He didn't move. They didn't leave. What would you do if wild animals started visiting you every single day? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months before Eric Vance found himself standing face to face with 3 wild wolves in the Wyoming wilderness, he was a different man, living a different life. He woke each morning at 5:30 in a modest ranch house in the suburbs of Denver, made coffee in a kitchen that still felt too quiet, and drove 40 minutes to construction sites where he supervised crews building office complexes and strip malls. He was good at his job, reliable. The kind of foreman contractors called first when they needed someone who understood both the work and the workers. But reliability doesn't protect you when the economy shifts. It doesn't save your savings when your mother spends 8 months dying in a hospital bed, fighting cancer with every treatment insurance would cover and several it wouldn't. Eric had been an only child, and his father had passed a decade earlier, so the responsibility fell entirely on his shoulders. He sat with her through the final weeks, holding her hand while machines beeped their mechanical rhythms, watching her fade a little more each day until finally, mercifully, she slipped away on a Tuesday morning in March. The medical bills arrived like a slow avalanche. Even with insurance, the costs were staggering. Experimental treatments, specialists, private rooms because Eric couldn't bear to see her suffer in a shared space. He'd cashed out his retirement accounts, taken loans against the house, maxed out credit cards he'd sworn he'd never touch. When she died, he was $60,000 in debt with a construction industry that was shedding workers like autumn leaves. His layoff came in July. Not his fault, the owner had said. Market conditions, fewer projects, they were cutting back everywhere. 2 weeks severance and a handshake that felt like a eulogy. Eric drove home that afternoon with the radio off, watching the city slide past his windows, wondering when everything had started to crumble. His marriage had ended 5 years earlier, though ended wasn't quite the right word. It had simply dissolved, the way morning fog lifts without ceremony. Helen was a good woman, still was, as far as Eric knew. They'd grown in different directions after their daughter left for college, discovered they'd been holding on to the framework of a relationship rather than the substance. The divorce was civil, almost friendly. They split everything fairly, wished each other well, and moved into separate lives without drama or bitterness. Their daughter, Vanessa, was 23 now and working as a junior marketing associate in Seattle. She called every couple of weeks, sent photos of her apartment and the coffee shop she'd discovered, talked about her career with the kind of excitement that made Eric proud, even as it reminded him how far away she'd become. Not distant in affection, but in life circumstance. She was building something. He was watching what he'd built fall apart. The foreclosure notice came in September. Eric had missed 3 mortgage payments, then 4. The bank was patient until it wasn't. He had 60 days to vacate. At night, he sat in that too-quiet kitchen and did the math over and over, trying to find a solution in numbers that refused to add up. He could file for bankruptcy, but that felt like admitting a failure so complete he couldn't face it. He could ask Vanessa for help, but she was just starting out, barely covering her own rent in one of the most expensive cities in the country. He could ask Helen, but pride stopped him every time he reached for the phone. Instead, Eric found himself thinking about his father, about the camping trips they'd taken when Eric was young, driving up to Wyoming in a pickup truck that rattled over every bump, sleeping in a canvas tent that smelled like mildew and pine. His father had been a quiet man, more comfortable in the woods than in conversation, but he'd taught Eric everything about survival, how to read a compass, how to build a fire in wet conditions, how to move through the forest without disturbing it, respecting the boundary between visitor and inhabitant. They'd camped near the Shoshone National Forest, miles from the nearest town, where the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. Eric remembered waking before dawn to watch elk move through morning mist, remembered his father's hand on his shoulder as they stood together, not needing words. Those had been good days, simple days, days when life made sense in a way it hadn't since. The compass was still in Eric's possession. He found it in a box of his father's things he'd kept after the estate sale, a tarnished brass instrument with a crack across the glass face, but the needle still true. He held it in his palm the night before the movers came, feeling its weight, remembering. That's when the idea formed. Not a plan, exactly, more like a recognition of the only path left available. Eric loaded his truck with what mattered: clothes, camping gear, tools, his father's compass, a few photographs. Everything else went to the curb or into storage he'd probably never reclaim. On a cold October morning, with the sun barely cresting the mountains to the east, he pointed the truck north and drove. He didn't tell Vanessa where he was going. He sent a text that said he needed some time to think, that he'd be out of touch for a while, that he loved her and not to worry. She called immediately, of course, but he let it go to voicemail. What could he say? That her father was running away? That at 50 years old he'd been beaten by life and was retreating to the only place that had ever felt like refuge? The drive took 11 hours. Eric stopped once for gas and a sandwich he barely tasted, then kept going, watching the landscape change from city to plains to foothills to mountains. He crossed into Wyoming as afternoon faded to evening, following old roads he half remembered from childhood, looking for landmarks that might still exist. He found the area on his second day of searching, a section of national forest not far from where he and his father had camped decades ago, remote enough that he'd seen no other vehicles for miles. The roads here were barely maintained, more suggestion than certainty, but his truck managed. He drove until the path became impassable, then parked and walked. The forest was exactly as he remembered, and completely different. The trees had grown, landmarks had shifted, but the feeling was the same, that sense of being held by something larger and older than human concerns. Eric walked for hours, his pack heavy on his shoulders, until he found what he was looking for. A clearing with a massive Douglas fir at its center, branches thick enough to support weight, high enough to offer safety from ground-level threats. This would do. Eric spent the next week building his treehouse. He drove back to the nearest town, a place called Kernville, population 800, and bought lumber, rope, tarps, and nails with money he couldn't afford to spend but had no choice about spending. The hardware store owner, a weathered man named Lloyd Hutchins, asked what he was building. Eric said a hunting platform. Lloyd nodded, didn't push. The construction was slow, careful work. Eric's carpentry skills were solid from decades in construction, but working alone 20 feet off the ground required patience. He built a platform first, 12 feet square, secured to the trunk and main branches with brackets he'd fabricated himself. Then walls, basic framing with plywood sheets and plastic sheeting for weatherproofing. A roof of corrugated metal he'd salvaged from a collapsed barn, a door that latched from the inside. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was solid, and it was shelter. And it was his. Eric moved in on a Sunday evening in late October as the first real cold front pushed down from Canada. He climbed the rope ladder he'd secured to the trunk, pulled his supplies up after him, and sat on the platform as darkness gathered. The forest grew quiet around him in that way wilderness does at night, not silent, but hushed, filled with small sounds of things moving and living and hunting. He made instant coffee on a camp stove, ate a granola bar for dinner, and wrapped himself in a sleeping bag that smelled like the basement of a house he no longer owned. Above him, through gaps in the trees, stars emerged in numbers impossible to see from the city. The Milky Way spread across the sky like spilled milk, beautiful and indifferent. Eric Vance fell asleep that night with his father's compass clutched in one hand, wondering what he'd become and whether anyone would care if he never went back. He woke to frost and the realization that he was more alone than he'd ever been in his life. The first 2 weeks were an exercise in survival. Eric established routines because routines kept you sane when everything else was uncertain. Wake at dawn, make coffee, ration food, carefully canned goods, dried pasta, oatmeal, nothing that required refrigeration, check the weather, maintain the shelter, walk the perimeter of his camp, learning the terrain, marking landmarks, making sure he could find his way back in any conditions. Water came from a creek a quarter-mile east, clear and cold. He boiled it religiously, remembering his father's warnings about giardia. He saw deer on these walks, and once an elk that watched him from 50 yards before deciding he wasn't a threat. Birds were everywhere, jays and nuthatches and chickadees that seemed curious about this new inhabitant of their territory. But no predators, no bears, though it was late enough in the season they'd likely be seeking dens. No mountain lions, though he knew they were there, watching from places he'd never see, and no wolves, which didn't surprise him. Wolves were rare in this part of Wyoming, their population still recovering from decades of extermination. Eric told himself he was thinking things through, planning his next move, figuring out how to rebuild. But mostly he was just existing day by day, letting the forest fill the spaces where worry and shame and failure had lived. On his third morning in the treehouse, everything changed. Eric woke that morning to a silence that felt different. He'd grown accustomed to the forest's rhythms, the early birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine branches. But this silence was complete, as if the woods were holding their breath. He sat up in his sleeping bag, listening. Nothing. Even the birds had gone quiet. Eric pulled on his boots and jacket, then climbed through the small door onto the platform. The sun was just breaking the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Frost covered everything in a glittering coat that would burn off by mid-morning. His breath came out in white puffs as he stood, stretching muscles stiff from the cold night. He was reaching for his camp stove to make coffee when he saw them. 3 wolves stood in the clearing below, perhaps 30 feet from the base of his tree. They were motionless, arranged in a loose triangle, all facing upward, all watching him. Eric froze. His heart kicked hard against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system with the ancient message, predator. The coffee forgotten, he gripped the railing of his platform, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. The largest wolf stood slightly ahead of the others. Male, Eric thought, judging by size and build. His coat was a mix of grey and silver, darker along the spine, and across his muzzle ran a distinctive scar, an old injury that had healed white against the dark fur. The wolf's eyes were pale amber, fixed on Eric with an intensity that was neither threatening nor friendly, simply observant. Behind him stood a slightly smaller wolf, also grey but with warmer brown tones through her coat. Female, Eric guessed. She held herself differently, alert but less dominant. And to the left, a younger male with darker colouring and less bulk, still growing into his frame. They didn't growl, didn't bare teeth, didn't show any of the aggressive postures Eric remembered from nature documentaries. They just watched. Eric's mind raced through everything he knew about wolves, which admittedly wasn't much. They hunted in packs. They were apex predators. They'd been nearly wiped out in the lower 48 states and were slowly, controversially, coming back. They generally avoided humans. Generally, but here they were. "Hey," Eric said softly, his voice sounding strange in the quiet. "Hey there." The scarred alpha's ears twitched at the sound, but nothing else changed. No retreat, no advance. Just that steady observation. Eric stood perfectly still. Moving felt dangerous, though he couldn't articulate why. Some instinct older than language told him that this moment required stillness, that any sudden action would break whatever strange détente had formed between him and these wild animals. Minutes passed. 5. Then 10. Eric's legs began to ache from standing motionless. The cold bit through his jacket. His coffee craving became a physical need. But he didn't move, and neither did the wolves. Finally, without any signal Eric could detect, the alpha turned. The other two followed immediately, and all three melted into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. One moment they were there, solid and real. The next, they were gone, leaving only tracks in the frost and Eric's hammering pulse. He waited another 5 minutes before allowing himself to move. When he did, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely light the camp stove. The wolves came back the next morning at almost exactly the same time. Eric was awake this time. He'd slept poorly, starting at every sound, half expecting to wake to wolves climbing his tree, though he knew that was irrational. When dawn approached, he was already on the platform, coffee in hand, waiting. They emerged from the trees like smoke solidifying. The same three, in the same formation, they took up positions in the clearing and looked up at him. "You're back," Eric said, keeping his voice low and even. "Didn't expect that." The alpha's ears swiveled toward him. Eric took a small step to his left, testing. All three wolves tracked the movement, but didn't react otherwise. He stepped back to where he'd been. They kept watching. This time, Eric tried sitting down, lowering himself slowly to the platform floor, legs dangling over the edge. The wolves remained standing, but something in their posture seemed to relax fractionally. Eric took a sip of his coffee. The female wolf yawned, not a threat display, just a yawn, showing all her teeth before her jaw clicked shut. They stayed for 15 minutes before leaving again, disappearing into the forest without sound or ceremony. On the third morning, Eric was ready with his father's old journal, a leather-bound notebook he'd brought on impulse. He began documenting everything he could observe. Time of arrival, approximately 6:15, just as the sun crested the eastern ridge. Weather, clear. Temperature in the low 30s. Pack composition, 3 wolves, 1 adult male scarred muzzle, appears to be alpha, 1 adult female, lighter build, brown-grey coat, 1 younger male, darker coloring, subordinate posture. He sketched rough drawings of their markings, trying to capture enough detail to identify each individual. The scar on the alpha's face made him easy. Eric started thinking of him as Scar, though he felt foolish naming wild animals. The female had a distinctive white patch on her chest. The younger male had one ear that stood more upright than the other. By the 5th morning, the visits had become routine. Eric would wake, make coffee, climb onto the platform, and wait. The wolves would arrive within minutes of 6:15, take up their positions, and watch him for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes before leaving. It was like they were checking on him, though that thought seemed absurd. On the 6th day, Eric tried something new. He'd bought supplies in town 2 days earlier, dried meat among them, though he could barely afford it. That morning, he tossed a piece of jerky down into the clearing, not close to the wolves, but not far either. They didn't react immediately. The alpha sniffed the air, clearly catching the scent. His gaze moved from Eric to the meat and back again. Then, in a movement so casual it seemed almost dismissive, he walked forward, picked up the jerky, and carried it to the edge of the clearing where he lay down and ate it while maintaining eye contact with Eric. The message was clear. "I'm not afraid of you, and I accept your offering on my terms." Eric laughed. He couldn't help it. The alpha's ears perked up at the sound, but he kept chewing. "All right then," Eric said. "We'll do this your way." The pattern continued. Each morning, the wolves came. Each morning, Eric left a small offering, never too much, never trying to lure them closer, just acknowledging their presence. The alpha always took it. Sometimes the female would as well. The younger male seemed more cautious, hanging back. After 2 weeks, Eric made his first trip back to town for supplies. He told himself he needed food and fuel, but part of him was testing something. Would they come back if he left? Or had his absence broken whatever strange bond was forming? The drive to Kernville took 40 minutes on rough roads. He went to the same hardware store where he'd bought his lumber. Lloyd Hutchins was behind the counter, reading a newspaper with photos of wolves on the front page. A story about the controversial reintroduction program in Yellowstone and whether it should be expanded. "Back again," Lloyd said, looking up. "That hunting platform working out?" "It's fine," Eric said, loading supplies on the counter. "Propane, canned goods, batteries. Staying up there through winter?" Lloyd's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Planning to. You know there's shelters in town. Church runs one, no questions asked." Eric met his gaze. "I'm not homeless, just prefer being out there." Lloyd nodded slowly. "Your business, but if you need anything proper gear, information about the area you come by. I was a wildlife biologist before I retired. Know these woods pretty well." That caught Eric's attention. "You study wolves?" "Among other things." "Why?" Eric hesitated. "Just curious. Seemed to be more around than I expected." "Could be," Lloyd said carefully. "There's been reports. Pack established itself northeast of here a couple years back. Fish and Wildlife keeps tabs on them when they can. You see any?" "Tracks," Eric said, which was true. "That's all." Lloyd rang up his purchases. "They'll leave you alone if you leave them alone. Smart animals. Misunderstood mostly. People think they're dangerous, but wolves almost never attack humans. Statistics don't lie." Eric paid and left with Lloyd's words running through his mind. Almost never. That almost was doing heavy lifting. When he got back to camp that afternoon, he half expected the clearing to be empty, the wolves gone for good, but at 6:15 the next morning, they were there again. All three, in their usual positions. The alpha looked at him, and Eric could have sworn there was recognition in those amber eyes. Not human recognition, but something deeper. Acknowledgement between two beings who'd both chosen this place, this forest, as refuge. "Missed you guys," Eric said quietly. Then, feeling foolish, he shook his head and went to make coffee. But the truth was, he had missed them. In 2 weeks, these wild animals had become the only consistent presence in his life. They asked nothing of him. They didn't judge his failures or question his choices. They simply showed up each morning, watched him for a while, and left. It was, Eric realized, the healthiest relationship he'd had in years. That afternoon, he called Vanessa for the first time since leaving. She answered on the first ring. "Dad, finally. Where are you?" "Wyoming. I'm safe. I'm fine. I just needed some time." "Time for what?" "Mom called me. She said the house was foreclosed." "Dad, what's going on?" Eric closed his eyes. "It's a long story. I'm working through some things. I promise I'll explain when I can." "Are you coming back?" He looked at the treehouse, at the forest, stretching in every direction, at the clearing where 3 wolves would appear again tomorrow morning. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. The rhythm of the forest became Eric's clock. He woke before dawn, not because an alarm forced him, but because his body had learned the light. The wolves arrived as the sun touched the treetops. The day unfolded in tasks that kept him warm and fed. Darkness came early this time of year, pulling a blanket over the woods by 5 in the afternoon, and Eric would retreat to his treehouse to read by lantern light or write in the journal that was filling steadily with observations. Week 3 brought the first real cold. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, and Eric woke one morning to find frost had formed on the inside of his walls where his breath had condensed. He spent that day weatherproofing, stuffing gaps with old clothes and tarp scraps, hanging a wool blanket across the doorway to hold in heat from his small propane heater. The wolves noticed the changes. That morning, when they arrived, the alpha spent several minutes studying the treehouse with what looked like curiosity. His head tilted as he examined the new configuration, and Eric felt absurdly like he was being evaluated by a building inspector. "Just winterizing," Eric explained. "Gets cold up here." The alpha's tail gave a single wag the first time Eric had seen any of them make that gesture. It felt significant somehow, like a small bridge being built between species. Eric had started leaving food at the base of the tree consistently now. Never much, just scraps from his own meals or pieces of the jerky he'd bought in bulk. The wolves accepted these offerings, but on their own terms. Sometimes they ate immediately. Sometimes they carried the food away. Once, the younger male buried his portion in leaves and came back for it 3 days later. What fascinated Eric most was their social dynamic. The alpha was clearly in charge, but not through aggression. Eric never saw him snarl or snap at the others. Instead, leadership seemed to flow through subtle gestures, the angle of his head, the direction of his gaze, the set of his shoulders. The female deferred to him, but not submissively. She had her own authority, and the younger male responded to both of them. They reminded Eric of the best construction crews he'd supervised. Everyone knew their role. Everyone worked together without constant direction. It was leadership through respect rather than fear. In his journal, Eric wrote, "Day 23, temp 18 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. All 3 wolves present, stayed 22 minutes. Alpha seems more comfortable with my movements. Female approached to within 20 feet of tree base, closest yet. Younger male, still cautious but curious." Question: how do they decide what's safe? What signals are they reading from me that I'm not aware of? The question haunted him. He knew he was doing something unprecedented, or at least highly unusual. Wild wolves weren't supposed to habituate to humans like this. Yet here they were, returning daily, showing no fear and no aggression. Just that steady, evaluating presence. Eric's weekly trips to town became exercises in discretion. He needed supplies but didn't want attention. Kernville was small enough that a stranger living in the woods would eventually become gossip, and gossip would bring questions he couldn't answer. Lloyd Hutchins seemed to sense this. The third time Eric came in, Lloyd was organizing fishing tackle behind the counter. He looked up and nodded. "Holding up okay out there?" "Well enough." "Cold snap coming next week. Real one. You got adequate shelter?" Eric thought of his plywood walls and plastic sheeting. "I'll manage." Lloyd studied him for a long moment. "You're not wanted by the law or anything, are you?" "No. Nothing like that. Running from something, though." It wasn't a question. Eric loaded batteries and propane canisters on the counter without answering. "I did that once," Lloyd continued. "After my wife died. Took a job surveying wolf populations in Alaska, spent 8 months in the bush. Thought I was going up there to study animals, but really I was just trying to outrun grief." Eric's hands stilled. "Did it work?" "No. Grief follows you everywhere. But being out there taught me something. Nature doesn't care about your pain, doesn't try to fix it or talk you out of it. It just exists alongside you. There's a kind of honesty in that." "Yeah," Eric said quietly. "There is." Lloyd rang up the purchases. As Eric was leaving, the older man called after him. "If you're seeing wolves, and I suspect you are, be careful. They're magnificent animals, but they're still wild. Don't confuse acceptance with domestication." Eric nodded and left, but the words stayed with him. That night, he video-called Vanessa. She answered from her apartment, and he could see the Seattle skyline through her window, all lights and geometry. "Dad, you look different." "Different how?" She tilted her head, studying him through the screen. "Thinner, weathered, but also less tired. Maybe? I don't know. Where are you exactly? Forest in Wyoming. I'm staying in a place I built. Built? Her eyebrows rose. Like a cabin? More like a treehouse. A treehouse. Dad, you're 50 years old. Turns out 50-year-olds can build treehouses. She laughed, but he could see the worry underneath. Mum's freaking out. She thinks you're having a breakdown. Maybe I am. Or maybe I already had it. And this is what coming out the other side looks like. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Are you safe? Yes. Are you happy? The question surprised him. Eric looked around his small space, the rough walls, the sleeping bag, the camp stove. Through the gaps in the boards, he could see stars. I don't know if happy is the word, but I'm not drowning anymore. Does that make sense? Yeah, she said softly. It does. I've been feeling like that lately too. Like I'm going through the motions but not sure why. What do you mean? She shrugged. Work is fine. Apartment is fine. Everything's fine. But I keep wondering if fine is enough, you know. If this is all there is. Eric felt a pang of recognition. His daughter was 23 and already feeling what had driven him to this forest. The sense that life was happening to you rather than being lived by you. You're young, he said. You've got time to figure it out. You're only 50. You've got time too. They talked for another 20 minutes about her job, about his survival setup, about everything except the real questions neither of them knew how to ask. When they disconnected, Eric sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of things unsaid. The next morning brought a shift in the wolves' behavior. They arrived as usual, but instead of taking their normal positions, the alpha came closer to the tree than he ever had before. He sat directly below Eric's platform, looking up. Eric barely breathed. This close, he could see the individual guard hairs in the wolf's coat, the yellow gold of his eyes, the network of old scars beneath the fur. This was an animal that had survived, that had fought and hunted and endured. "What do you want?" Eric whispered. The alpha held his gaze for what felt like an eternity. Then, deliberately, he lay down, stretched out on the frozen ground with his head on his paws, still watching, but in a posture of complete relaxation. The female and younger male followed suit, arranging themselves in a loose circle around the tree base. They stayed like that for 40 minutes, the longest they'd ever remained. And in that time, something shifted in Eric. The fear he'd been carrying, the sense that this was temporary or dangerous or unsustainable, began to ease. These animals had chosen to trust him, not because they needed him or wanted something from him, but because, in their assessment, he was safe. He belonged here. When they finally rose and left, moving into the trees with that fluid wolf gait, Eric found he couldn't move for several minutes. His face was wet, and he realized he was crying the first time he'd cried since his mother died. But these weren't tears of grief. They were something else. Release, maybe, or recognition. He was being seen by these wolves, not as a failure or a construction foreman or someone who couldn't keep his life together, just as another creature sharing this forest, another being trying to survive. That afternoon, Eric did something he hadn't done in months. He called his ex-wife. "Helen, it's me." "Eric," her voice was tight with worry and anger. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been? Vanessa said you're living in a treehouse." "I am. And I'm okay. I know it sounds crazy. It sounds like you're having a breakdown. Maybe. But Helen, I need you to trust me. I need time. I need to work through some things out here. Can you give me that?" Silence. Then, "How long?" "I don't know. Through the winter, at least." "That's 3 months, Eric." "I know." More silence. He could picture her in her kitchen, probably holding a cup of tea, probably standing by the window, the way she always did when processing difficult news. "You promise you're safe? You're not going to do anything stupid?" "I promise. I'm safer here than I've been in years." "That makes no sense." "I know. But it's true." She sighed, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times in their 25 years together. Fine. You have until spring. But Eric, if I don't hear from you regularly, I'm calling the authorities. I mean it. Thank you. After they hung up, Eric sat with his father's compass in his hand, feeling its familiar weight. The needle pointed north, steady and sure. It had always pointed north. He'd just forgotten how to trust it. November brought snow. Not the light dustings Eric had seen so far, but a real storm that rolled down from the mountains and buried the forest under 8 inches of white silence. He woke to a world transformed, every branch weighted with snow, every sound muffled by the thick blanket covering the ground. The wolves came anyway. Eric watched them emerge from the trees, their dark forms stark against the white landscape. They moved differently in snow, lifting their paws higher, their breath creating clouds in the freezing air. The alpha shook himself, sending a spray of powder flying, and Eric couldn't help but smile. "Determined, aren't you?" he called down. The alpha looked up, and Eric would swear the animal's expression showed something like acknowledgement, maybe even amusement, though he knew he was probably projecting human emotions onto wild intelligence. The snow made everything harder. Eric's water source partially froze, forcing him to break ice each morning. His rope ladder grew slick and dangerous. The cold penetrated his shelter despite his weatherproofing efforts, and he woke each night to add another layer to his sleeping bag cocoon. But there was beauty in the hardship. The forest in winter possessed a stark clarity he'd never experienced. Everything essential remained: the trees, the sky, the clean lines of survival, while everything decorative fell away. It felt appropriate somehow, mirroring his own life stripped to its core. Eric's survival skills sharpened by necessity. He learned to read weather signs in the clouds and wind direction. He discovered which trees provided the best kindling and how to start a fire with damp wood using birch bark as tinder. His father's hunting knife became an extension of his hand, used for everything from cutting rope to preparing the rabbits he occasionally trapped. He wasn't proud of the trapping, but protein was protein, and his money was running dangerously low. The wolves seemed to understand this pragmatism. Once, the alpha brought Eric the remains of an elk. The pack had killed a gift of haunches that Eric smoked over his fire, making the meat last for weeks. The gesture stunned him. Wolves didn't share food with other species. Yet here was evidence, undeniable, that something unprecedented was happening. In his journal, Eric wrote, "Day 37, heavy snow, temp 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Alpha brought elk meat approximately 15 pounds. This goes beyond curiosity or tolerance. They're actively engaging." Question: am I being adopted into the pack? Do wolves even do that? Need to research if I can get to the library. 2 days later, he made the drive to Kernville. The roads were treacherous, his truck sliding on ice despite 4-wheel drive. But he needed supplies, and more than that, he needed information. Lloyd's hardware store was warm and bright, a wood stove crackling in the corner. The older man looked up from paperwork as Eric entered, snow melting off his boots onto the mat. "Wondered if you'd make it down." Storm was rough. "I managed." Eric loaded supplies on the counter, then hesitated. "You mentioned being a wildlife biologist. You have any books about wolves? Behavior, specifically?" Lloyd's eyes sharpened with interest. "Seeing them regular now?" "Some." "How many?" "3. Always the same 3. Lloyd was quiet for a moment, studying Eric with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Finally, the older man walked to a back room and returned with several thick volumes. "These are mine, academic texts, some field journals. You can borrow them if you promise to return them." "I will." "Thank you." "Eric, it is Eric, right?" Lloyd waited for his nod. "What you're describing isn't normal wolf behavior. If they're habituating to you, visiting regularly, that's significant, possibly dangerous. They haven't shown any aggression yet, But habituation can go wrong fast. Wolf gets too comfortable, stops seeing humans as separate. Then someone else comes along, and the wolf treats them the same way it treats you. That's how animals get shot. Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What should I do? Document everything. Times, behaviors, interactions. If you're witnessing something unusual, it needs to be recorded properly. And for God's sake, don't feed them anymore. Too late for that, Eric thought, but he nodded. That evening, by lantern light, Eric devoured the books. He learned that wolf packs were complex family units, not the aggressive hierarchies popular culture portrayed. The alpha wasn't a tyrant, but a parent, leading through experience and wisdom. Packs formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, communicated through postures and vocalizations so subtle they were hard for humans to detect. He learned that wolves could travel 50 miles in a day, that their hearing was so acute they could detect a mouse moving under 2 feet of snow, that they remembered individual humans for years. Most importantly, he learned that what was happening to him, this daily interaction, this mutual acceptance, was extraordinarily rare. There were historical accounts of wolves tolerating human presence, even protecting humans in extreme circumstances, but they were few and considered anomalies. Eric was living an anomaly. The next morning, he started photographing the wolves. He'd brought a cheap digital camera with him, never expecting to use it, but now it became essential. He documented their visits, capturing the alpha's scarred face, the female's distinctive white chest patch, the younger male's uneven ears. The wolves seemed unconcerned by the camera. If anything, the alpha appeared to pose, sitting in clear morning light, his profile sharp against the snow. "Show off," Eric muttered, clicking the shutter. As November became December, the temperature continued dropping. Eric woke one morning to find it was 4 degrees below zero, and his breath froze on his beard. His propane heater struggled to keep the treehouse above freezing. He wore every layer he owned, and still shivered. But the wolves arrived. They always arrived. That day, they stayed for over an hour. The alpha and female lay in the snow, while the younger male played actual play, pouncing on nothing, rolling and twisting like an oversized puppy. Eric watched, mesmerized, as the 2 adults occasionally joined in, the whole pack engaging in what could only be called joy. When they finally left, Eric realized something fundamental had shifted in him. He'd come to this forest to hide, to escape from a life that had fallen apart. But somewhere along the way, hiding had become living. Escape had become presence. He was here, fully here, not thinking about the past or worrying about the future, just existing in this moment with these animals in this impossible winter. That afternoon, Vanessa called. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Her tone made him sit up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I quit my job." Eric's heart sank. "Vanessa, let me finish. I quit because I realized I was doing exactly what you did, going through motions, telling myself I was building something when really I was just treading water. And then I thought about you in your treehouse, and I realized you're the bravest person I know." "Brave?" "I ran away." "No, you stopped doing what didn't work and tried something different. That's not running, that's adapting. So I quit, and I'm using my savings to take 3 months off. I'm going to figure out what I actually want instead of what I think I should want." Eric felt emotion tighten his throat. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you too, Dad, even if you are living in a tree." They talked for an hour longer than they'd talked in years. She asked about his daily routine, and he found himself describing the wolves. Not everything, but enough that she understood something significant was happening. "You should write about this," she said, "or take pictures. Dad, people would want to know about this." "Maybe," Eric said, though the thought of sharing this experience felt like a violation. These mornings with the wolves weren't for anyone else. They were private, sacred even. After they disconnected, Eric sat watching the sun set through the trees. Pink and orange painted the snow, and in the distance he heard a wolf howl, then another, harmonizing. The sound raised every hair on his body, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition of a language older than words. He stepped out onto his platform and, feeling foolish and exhilarated, howled back. The forest went silent. Then, impossibly, the wolves answered, a chorus of voices welcoming his clumsy attempt at communication. Eric laughed until tears ran down his face, freezing in his beard. He was alive, more alive than he'd been in decades. The 6th week marked a turning point. Eric woke one morning to find a gift at the base of his tree, a deer antler, fresh enough that it still had velvet clinging to the base. He climbed down carefully, examined it in his hands. The bone was heavy, smooth, marked with scratches that told a story he was learning to read. Wolf teeth had scored the surface. This wasn't coincidence or random forest debris. The wolves had brought this here deliberately, placed it where Eric would find it. He looked up to see all 3 wolves watching from the tree line, the alpha's amber eyes steady on him. Eric held up the antler in acknowledgement, and the alpha's tail gave that single wag that had become familiar. "Thank you," Eric said, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to wild animals. They'd earned his words. The antler became the centerpiece of his small collection of forest artifacts. He kept it inside the treehouse, next to his father's compass and the growing stack of journals documenting his strange new life. Sometimes he held it while reading Lloyd's books, letting his fingers trace the grooves the wolves' teeth had made. December deepened into true winter. Snow fell almost daily now, accumulating in drifts that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Eric's world contracted to the essentials: stay warm, stay fed, stay present. The wolves continued their daily visits, and their behavior grew more complex. The female started bringing the younger male closer to the tree. They'd sit together while the alpha patrolled the perimeter of the clearing, and Eric began to understand that he was watching education. The female was teaching the younger wolf about him, about boundaries, about how to exist near humans without fear or aggression. Eric documented everything in his journal, filling pages with sketches and observations. He noted that the wolves arrived slightly later as winter progressed, adapting their schedule to the shorter days. He recorded their hunting patterns, following their tracks in the snow to see where they went after leaving his camp. One day he tracked them to an elk kill 2 miles east. The pack had taken down a bull, and Eric stood at a respectful distance, observing the hierarchy of feeding. The alpha ate first, but not greedily. He took his share and stepped back, allowing the female access. The younger male fed last. Though Eric noticed the others didn't prevent him from eating, they simply maintained order. It reminded Eric of family dinners when Vanessa was young. Not the rigid hierarchy of domination, but the gentle structure of care. Parents making sure everyone was fed, teaching patience and respect through example rather than force. That evening, Lloyd made an unexpected appearance at Eric's camp. The older man hiked in just before sunset, carrying a pack and breathing hard from the elevation. "Wasn't sure I'd find you," Lloyd said, looking up at the treehouse. "That's quite a setup. How did you find me?" "Small town. Someone mentioned seeing your truck parked out by the old logging road. I got curious." Lloyd's eyes scanned the clearing, taking in everything: the fire pit, the rope ladder, the tracks in the snow. "Those wolf prints?" Eric hesitated, then nodded. "Fresh ones too. They were here today. They come every morning." Lloyd set down his pack and pulled out a thermos. "Mind if I sit? I brought coffee." They sat on logs Eric had arranged around his fire pit, drinking coffee while darkness settled over the forest. Eric found himself talking, explaining the pattern that had developed, the gifts, the communication. "I know it sounds crazy," Eric said, "but it's real. They're engaging with me intentionally." "I don't think it's crazy," Lloyd said quietly. "Unlikely, unprecedented even." but not crazy. I've spent 40 years studying animal behavior, and I've learned that intelligence takes forms we barely understand. These wolves have made a choice about you. Question is, why? I don't know. Maybe you're not a threat. Maybe you fit into their territory in a way that makes sense to them. Or maybe... Lloyd paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe they recognize something in you. Loneliness, perhaps. Wolves are social animals. They understand isolation and what it means to be outside the pack. The words hit Eric harder than he expected. He stared into his coffee, feeling exposed. I brought something, Lloyd continued, pulling a small device from his pack. Trail camera. Would you be willing to set it up? If we can document this properly, it could be important for wolf conservation. Show people that wolves aren't the monsters they've been made out to be. Eric's first instinct was to refuse. This felt private, sacred, but he thought about Lloyd's words: conservation, education, changing minds. I'll think about it, Eric said. Lloyd nodded and didn't push. They talked until full dark, about wolves and wilderness and what it meant to step outside the structures society built. When Lloyd finally left, trudging back toward town with a headlamp lighting his way, Eric felt both relieved and troubled. Sharing this meant opening it to judgment, to interference, to the possibility that authorities would force him out or harm the wolves in the name of safety. But keeping it secret meant losing the opportunity to show people something beautiful. The next morning, the wolves arrived to find Eric installing the trail camera. He'd positioned it in a tree across the clearing, angled to capture the area where the pack usually gathered. The alpha watched the process with what looked like suspicion, approaching the camera tree and sniffing thoroughly. It's just a camera, Eric explained. Won't hurt you, just takes pictures. The alpha looked at him, then at the camera, then back at him. After a long moment, he sat down in his usual spot, seemingly accepting this new element. Over the following days, the camera captured remarkable footage. Eric reviewed it on the device's small screen, watching moments he'd missed. The wolves arriving before dawn, waiting for him to wake. The younger male practicing his howl while the adults watched with what looked like patience. The female grooming the alpha, maintaining social bonds through physical contact. One clip showed all three wolves sleeping in a pile near his tree, something Eric had never seen during his waking hours. They felt safe enough here to be vulnerable, to rest completely. Eric sent the footage to Lloyd, who called within hours. This is extraordinary. I've shown it to colleagues, didn't give location, don't worry. But Eric, this needs proper documentation. Research-grade observation. Would you consider allowing a small team to visit? No. The answer came immediately, instinctively. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I understand. But think about it. What you're witnessing could change how we understand interspecies communication. That night, Eric called Vanessa again. She'd been traveling, she said, hiking in national parks, staying in cheap motels, trying to figure out what came next. I think I want to work with non-profits, she told him. Conservation, maybe. Something that matters. What made you think of that? You, actually. You're living this simple life, but it's real. It matters. I want to find that. Work that feels meaningful instead of just busy. Eric felt pride swell in his chest. You'll figure it out. You're brave enough to try. Learned it from you, Dad. After they hung up, Eric sat in the darkness of his treehouse, listening to the forest. An owl called nearby. Wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean. And somewhere out there, three wolves were living their lives, crossing territory he now understood through their tracks and patterns. He'd come here broken, believing he'd lost everything worth having. But in this brutal simplicity, surrounded by animals that owed him nothing and gave him everything, Eric had found something he didn't know he was looking for. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but presence. The ability to be fully in his own life, stripped of pretense and performance. The wolves had taught him that. Simply by showing up each day, by accepting him without judgment, by existing alongside him in patient observation. He fell asleep thinking about Lloyd's request, about what it would mean to share this. In his dreams, he ran with the wolves through snow-covered forests, part of the pack, finally belonging somewhere. The trail camera changed everything, though not in ways Eric expected. He'd agreed to let it run continuously, checking the footage every few days, and what he discovered astonished him. The wolves visited his camp far more frequently than just the morning sessions he witnessed. They came in the afternoons while he was gathering firewood. They passed through at midnight, pausing to look up at his darkened treehouse. Once, during a brutal snowstorm, all three had sheltered beneath his platform for hours. They'd woven his presence into their territory, their daily patterns. He wasn't just being observed, he was being included. Eric began experimenting with the camera, setting it at different angles, trying to capture the full scope of their behavior. In one remarkable sequence, he caught the alpha teaching the younger male to hunt. They'd cornered a rabbit in a hollow log, and the alpha held back, allowing the younger wolf to make the attempt. When the young male failed, lunging too early, the alpha demonstrated with patient precision. It was teaching. Deliberate, structured teaching between animals most people still considered mere instinct-driven predators. Lloyd visited again in mid-December, this time bringing supplies Eric hadn't asked for but desperately needed: a better tarp, warmer gloves, food that would last. "Can't have you freezing before we get proper documentation," Lloyd said, though his eyes were kind. "Consider it a research investment." "I'm not a research project." "No. But what's happening here is... Eric, I've been doing this 40 years. I've never seen anything like this. Hell, I've never heard of anything like this." They sat by Eric's fire as afternoon light faded to blue twilight. Lloyd had brought a portable hard drive, and together they reviewed the footage on Eric's laptop, powered by a solar battery system Lloyd had helped him install on his last visit. "There," Lloyd said, pausing the video. "See how the female positions herself? She's creating a barrier between you and the younger male. Not aggressive, just protective. She's still not entirely convinced you're safe. But the alpha is? The alpha decided weeks ago. He's the one who brought the others around. Watch this sequence from last Tuesday." Lloyd pulled up another clip showing the alpha approaching Eric's tree alone, carrying something in his mouth. He deposited it at the base, a small bird, freshly killed, then sat watching the treehouse for nearly an hour. "He brought you food," Lloyd said. "That's provisioning behavior. That's what pack members do for each other when one is injured or unable to hunt." Eric stared at the screen. "He thinks I'm part of the pack? I think he's decided you're under his protection. You're in his territory, you're not a threat, and you're vulnerable. From a wolf's perspective, that makes you someone worth looking after." The implications settled over Eric like the weight of snow on branches. These animals hadn't just accepted him, they'd adopted him. In their own way, according to their own logic, they'd made him pack. "What happens when I leave?" Eric asked quietly. Lloyd was silent for a long moment. "I don't know. Wolves form deep bonds. Disrupting them can cause stress, behavioral changes. But you can't stay here forever." "Why not?" "Because winter won't. Spring comes, rangers start patrolling more frequently, hikers come back. Someone's going to find you, and when they do, questions get asked. Questions lead to wildlife management getting involved, and wildlife management might decide these wolves are habituated and dangerous." "They're not dangerous. We know that. But habituated wolves get relocated or destroyed. You know that's true." Eric did know. He'd read enough in Lloyd's books to understand that wolves comfortable around humans were considered liabilities, risks waiting to happen. Never mind that these particular wolves had shown nothing but peaceful curiosity. "There might be another way," Lloyd said carefully. "If we document this properly, publish findings, show the scientific community what's possible, we could make a case for protection." Designate this area as special research territory. Keep it off limits to the public, allow you to continue observing under official capacity. I'm not a scientist. No, but I am. And I could make you a research assistant. It's been done before with citizen scientists. You'd need to learn proper methodology, keep better records, but it's possible. Eric looked at the fire, watching flames dance in the darkness. The offer was tempting a way to legitimize what he was doing, protect the wolves, maybe even find a path forward that didn't involve losing everything again. But it also meant bureaucracy, oversight, rules. It meant transforming something wild and pure into something managed and categorized. Let me think about it, Eric said. Over the next week, the weather turned vicious. An Arctic front pushed down from Canada, bringing temperatures that plunged to 20 below zero. Eric's propane heater ran constantly, barely keeping the treehouse above freezing. His water froze solid. His fingers went numb doing the simplest tasks. The wolves came anyway. Every morning, without fail, they appeared through the blowing snow and killing cold, checking on him. On the worst day, when Eric could barely feel his feet and his lips had cracked from the dry cold, the alpha did something unprecedented. He approached the base of the tree and began digging in the snow, piling it against the trunk, creating a windbreak. The other two joined him, and together they built a barrier that redirected the wind away from Eric's shelter. Eric watched from above, too stunned to move. When they finished, the alpha looked up at him and vocalized a low sound that carried somehow over the wind. Then all three lay down in the windbreak they'd created, adding their body heat to the protection. They stayed for 3 hours. When the storm finally broke and the wolves departed, Eric climbed down and examined their work. The windbreak was crude but effective. The temperature near his tree had risen by several degrees. They'd helped him survive. He called Lloyd that evening, his decision made. I'll do it. The research assistant thing. Whatever it takes to protect them. You're sure? They saved my life today. The least I can do is try to save theirs. Lloyd was quiet. Tell me what happened. Eric described the windbreak, the wolves' deliberate action, their vigil through the worst of the storm. When he finished, Lloyd's voice was thick with emotion. I need to bring someone up there, a colleague from the university. She specializes in wolf behavior, and she needs to see this. When? After Christmas. Give you some time to prepare. But Eric, this is going to change things. Once the scientific community knows, it won't be your secret anymore. I know. That night, Eric wrote in his journal, Day 58, temperature negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wolves built a windbreak to protect me from the storm. They stayed for 3 hours, adding their warmth to mine. I came to this forest thinking I was alone, that I'd lost my pack. But I was wrong. Pack isn't just the family you're born into or the one you build through marriage. Sometimes pack is 3 wild animals who decide you're worth protecting, who show up every day, regardless of weather or hardship, just to make sure you're okay. I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't let anything happen to them. Whatever it takes. Christmas came quietly. Vanessa sent a package via Lloyd, warm socks, waterproof matches, beef jerky, and a photo of the two of them from years ago, standing in front of the Christmas tree when she was young. Eric propped it against the wall of his treehouse. This reminder of who he'd been. Helen called too, her voice softer than he remembered. Merry Christmas, Eric. Merry Christmas. Vanessa says you're doing better, that you're working with a wildlife biologist now. Something like that. I'm glad. I was worried we'd lost you. You almost did. But I think I'm finding my way back. Good. That's good. After they hung up, Eric sat watching the forest through his small window. Snow fell in the darkness, coating everything in fresh white. And in the distance, barely audible, he heard wolves singing. Their howls rose and fell, harmonizing in ways that touched something primal in his chest. He didn't howl back this time, he just listened, grateful to hear their voices, grateful to be alive in this moment. The wolves arrived on Christmas morning, all three, and stayed longer than usual. Eric gave them each a piece of the venison he'd been saving, and they accepted his gifts with the dignity of old friends. It was, Eric thought, the best Christmas he'd had in years. The morning started like any other. Eric woke before dawn, made coffee on his camp stove, and climbed onto the platform to wait for the wolves. The temperature had moderated slightly, only 10 degrees, which felt almost balmy after the recent deep freeze. Snow had fallen overnight, fresh and unmarked, waiting to record the day's story. The wolves were late. 6:15 passed, then 6:30. Eric felt the first stirrings of concern. In nearly 2 months, they'd never missed a morning visit. He told himself they were hunting, that they'd found prey and lost track of time. Wolves didn't operate on human schedules, but the concern wouldn't leave. At 7 o'clock, Eric was about to climb down when he heard something, not the wolves' usual silent approach, but crashing through underbrush. The younger male burst into the clearing, alone, moving with frantic energy. He ran to the base of Eric's tree and began vocalizing, high-pitched sounds Eric had never heard from him before. "What's wrong?" Eric called down, his heart rate spiking. The young wolf ran in a circle, came back to the tree, looked up at Eric with wild eyes. Then he ran toward the forest edge, stopped, looked back. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Eric grabbed his pack, threw in basic supplies, and descended as fast as he dared. The young wolf was already moving, glancing back every few yards to ensure Eric followed. They moved fast through the forest, the wolf setting a pace Eric struggled to match. His breath came hard in the cold air, his legs burning as they navigated terrain made treacherous by snow. They traveled for what felt like miles, but was probably less than one. The young wolf led him away from familiar territory into an area Eric had never explored. The trees grew denser here, the ground more uneven. Eric followed the wolf's tracks when he couldn't see the animal itself, trusting completely. Then the young wolf stopped at the edge of a steep ravine. Eric approached carefully, his stomach dropping as he understood. The ravine cut deep into the earth, rocky walls descending 30 or 40 feet to a boulder-strewn bottom. And there, among the rocks, he saw movement. The alpha and female stood at the bottom, looking up. They weren't injured, he could see them moving normally, but they were agitated, pacing, and as Eric's eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw why. A man lay crumpled between two large boulders. Even from this distance, Eric could see the unnatural angle of his body, the bright colors of modern hiking gear stark against the grey stone. "Oh God," Eric breathed. The alpha looked up at him and vocalized, the same urgent sound the young male had made. They'd found this person how long ago, Eric couldn't tell, and somehow determined that Eric could help. That Eric should help. Eric pulled out his phone, knowing before he checked that there'd be no signal. He was too deep in the forest, too far from any tower. He looked down at the injured man again, trying to assess the situation. The hiker wasn't moving, but Eric thought he could see the shallow rise and fall of breathing. Alive, then. But for how long? In these temperatures, hypothermia would set in fast. If the man had been here overnight, he was probably already in serious trouble. Eric's mind raced through options. He could run back to his camp, drive to town, bring help, but that would take hours, 3 or 4 at least, accounting for the hike out and the drive. The man might not have hours, or he could go down there himself, try to stabilize the victim, keep him warm, then go for help. The second option was dangerous. Eric had rope in his pack, but not enough for a safe descent and ascent. He had first aid supplies, but nothing adequate for serious trauma. He was one 50-year-old man with rusty skills, trying to execute a rescue that should require a trained team. But he was also the only option this person had. "Okay," Eric said aloud, more to steady himself than anything. "Okay, we're doing this." He looked at the young wolf, who'd sat down to watch him, tongue lolling in what might have been anxiety. The alpha and female were still at the bottom, still watching. Eric pulled out his rope, 60 feet of climbing cord he'd been using for various camp tasks. He tested several trees near the ravine edge, looking for one strong enough to anchor his weight. A thick pine 30 feet back from the edge looked solid. He tied the rope around it using a bowline knot his father had taught him decades ago, tested it with his full weight, then tied a makeshift harness around his waist. His hands were shaking, not just from cold but from fear. He was out of practice, out of shape, and about to trust his life to a system he'd rigged himself. But the alternative was leaving someone to die. Eric backed toward the edge, feeding rope through his gloved hands, and began his descent. The wolves watched silently. The rock face was irregular, offering footholds that were sometimes solid and sometimes crumbled under his weight. Twice he slipped, his heart lurching as the rope caught him. His shoulders burned with the effort of controlling his descent. It took 10 minutes that felt like an hour, but finally Eric's feet touched the bottom of the ravine. The alpha and female immediately moved to flank him, as if providing protection or support. Up close, Eric could see they had both been down here a while. Their fur was damp with melted snow, their paws muddy. He approached the injured man carefully. Male, maybe 40 years old, dressed in expensive hiking gear that hadn't been enough to save him from whatever accident had sent him over the edge. A large backpack lay several feet away, contents scattered among the rocks. Eric knelt beside him, pulled off a glove, and checked for a pulse, there weak and thready but present. The man's lips were blue, his exposed skin waxy with cold. His left leg was bent at a wrong angle, clearly broken. Blood had dried on his temple from a head wound, and when Eric carefully felt around his torso, the man groaned, a good sign, meaning he wasn't completely unconscious, but also suggesting broken ribs or internal injuries. "Hey," Eric said loudly. "Can you hear me? I'm here to help." The man's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He mumbled something incomprehensible. Eric looked up at the rim of the ravine, calculating. No way could he get this man out alone, and no way could he move him safely, even if he could. The victim needed professional rescue, a team with proper equipment, a stretcher, medical supplies, which meant Eric had to go for help. Had to leave this man here and pray he survived a few more hours. But first, Eric did what he could. He pulled emergency blankets from his pack and wrapped them around the victim. He positioned the man's broken leg as carefully as possible, using rocks to stabilize it. He checked the head wound, superficial, thankfully. The bleeding already stopped. "I'm going to get help," Eric said, not sure if the man could hear. You hold on. Understand?" No response. Eric stood, looked at the wolves. The alpha met his eyes with that steady amber gaze. "Watch him," Eric said. Then, feeling the absurdity and necessity of it simultaneously, "Please, just stay with him until I get back." The alpha lay down next to the injured man, close enough to provide warmth. The female did the same on the other side, creating a barrier against the cold with their bodies, the same way they'd helped Eric during the storm. Eric climbed back up the rope, his muscles screaming, adrenaline the only thing keeping him moving. When he reached the top, he didn't stop. He ran. Eric ran through the forest like a man possessed. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, the young wolf kept pace easily, occasionally ranging ahead as if urging him to move faster. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows through the trees, but Eric barely noticed. Every second counted. He reached his camp in 30 minutes, a journey that should have taken 45. His hands shook as he grabbed his truck keys, his phone, additional rope and supplies he should have brought the first time. The young wolf watched from the clearing as Eric threw everything into his pack. "Stay here," Eric told him. "Stay with your pack. I'll bring help." The wolf sat, and Eric had the irrational thought that the animal understood, that all of this, the urgent summons, the guidance to the ravine, the vigil the alpha and female were keeping, was coordinated behavior that shouldn't be possible. But there was no time to process that now. Eric's truck roared to life on the second try, the engine protesting the cold. He drove as fast as he dared on the narrow forest roads, fishtailing on ice, branches scraping the sides. His phone showed no signal for the first 20 minutes, then one bar, then two. He pulled over and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? I found an injured hiker. He's at the bottom of a ravine, multiple injuries, including a broken leg and possible head trauma. He's hypothermic and needs immediate rescue. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. What's your location, sir? Eric gave the coordinates as best he could, describing the logging road and landmarks. I'm about 8 miles from Kernville. The victim is another 2 miles into the forest from my camp on foot. You'll need a rescue team with climbing gear. Are you with the victim now? No, I had to leave him to call for help. There's no signal out there. Sir, can you return to the victim and stay with him until help arrives? Eric thought of the wolves, of the alpha lying beside the injured man, providing warmth that might be the only thing keeping him alive. There's someone with him, Eric said, which was technically true, even if not in the way the dispatcher would understand. Another hiker? Just send help. Fast. He doesn't have much time. Eric gave additional details, the victim's condition, the supplies he'd left, the estimated time the man had been exposed. The dispatcher kept him on the line while coordinating with search and rescue, and Eric heard the machinery of emergency response grinding into action. How long? Eric asked. Rescue team is assembling now. They should be en route within 30 minutes, but sir, it's a difficult access area. It could be 2 to 3 hours before they reach the victim. 2 to 3 hours. In temperatures that were still well below freezing, with injuries that could kill him at any moment. I'm going back, Eric said. I'll meet your team at the trailhead and guide them in. He hung up before the dispatcher could argue and drove the remaining distance to Kernville at speeds that were reckless and necessary. The small town was just waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, a few trucks at the diner. Eric screeched to a stop at the ranger station, a modest building on the town's edge. Inside, he found a young ranger named Cooper finishing his morning coffee. The man looked up in surprise as Eric burst through the door. There's an injured hiker, Eric said without preamble. Search and rescue is on the way, but I need to guide them in. I know where he is. Cooper stood immediately, reaching for his radio. You called it in? Just now. He's in bad shape, been there overnight at least, maybe longer. Within minutes, Cooper had confirmed the rescue operation, grabbed emergency supplies, and was following Eric back toward the forest access road. They met the search and rescue team, 6 people with serious equipment at the trailhead 20 minutes later. Eric recognized the team leader, a woman named Patricia Garner he'd seen around town. She approached with a map and GPS unit. You found him? About 2 hours ago. He's at the bottom of a ravine, coordinates approximately here. Eric pointed on her map. Multiple injuries, hypothermic. I left emergency blankets but couldn't move him. You went down to him? Patricia's eyebrows rose. Had to assess his condition. That was dangerous, and you came back out alone. No choice. No cell signal in there. Patricia studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, you're coming with us. We'll need you to show us exactly where he is. The rescue team moved efficiently, their training evident in every action. They had a portable stretcher, climbing gear, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Eric led them into the forest, following the path he'd taken twice now, the route burned into his memory. The young wolf was gone when they passed Eric's camp, which was probably for the best. The last thing this situation needed was questions about why a wolf had been hanging around. As they hiked, Patricia asked questions. How had Eric found the victim? What made him go that deep into the forest? Eric kept his answers vague. He'd been out checking trap lines, heard something unusual, investigated. Technical truths that avoided the impossible reality of wolves seeking human help. Lloyd appeared on the trail ahead, hiking toward them with his own pack. He must have heard about the rescue on his scanner. "Eric," Lloyd said, relief evident in his voice. "I heard the call. The victim, is it related to your wolves?" "Later," Eric said quietly, aware of the rescue team listening. "I'll explain later." They reached the ravine in just over an hour, the team moving faster than Eric had alone. Patricia immediately began assessing the descent route, while two team members set up anchors and rope systems. Eric looked down into the ravine and his heart leaped. The alpha and female were still there, still lying on either side of the injured man. They looked up as the humans arrived, their amber eyes watchful but unconcerned. "Holy hell!" one of the rescuers breathed. "Are those wolves?" "Don't approach them," Patricia ordered. "Someone, radio wildlife management." "No," Eric said sharply. "They're not bothering anyone. They're just there. They're too close to a human." "That's habituated behavior." Lloyd stepped forward. "I'm a wildlife biologist. Those wolves aren't showing any aggressive behavior. They're actually helping look at their positioning. They're providing warmth to the victim." Patricia stared down at the scene, clearly struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with protocol. Finally, she shook her head. "Fine. We'll deal with the wolves after we get the victim out. Team, prepare for descent. Medical first, questions later." Two paramedics rappelled down with practiced ease, their movements smooth and confident. The wolves didn't retreat when the humans reached the bottom. The alpha simply stood, moved back a few feet, and sat watching. The female did the same. The paramedics worked quickly, checking vitals, stabilizing the victim's neck and leg, preparing him for transport. Eric could hear fragments of their communication. Pulse weak but steady, respirations shallow, core temperature 89 degrees, multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. They wrapped the man in thermal blankets, secured him to a rescue stretcher, and signaled for the team above to begin hauling. The operation took another hour, careful and methodical, everyone working together to bring the victim up the ravine wall without causing further injury. When the stretcher finally reached the top, the paramedics continued their assessment while Patricia coordinated helicopter evacuation. The man was too critical to risk the long hike out. Eric watched it all from a distance, his part done. Below, the alpha and female had climbed out of the ravine using a natural path Eric hadn't noticed before. They stood at the forest edge with the young wolf, who'd reappeared from somewhere. All three watched the humans working, their presence quiet and undeniable. Lloyd moved to stand beside Eric. "They found him, didn't they? They found him and brought you to help." "Yes. My God, Eric. Do you understand what this means?" Eric did. It meant everything was about to change. The helicopter arrived within the hour, its rotors beating the air and sending snow swirling in violent patterns. The rescue team had cleared a landing zone in a nearby meadow, and Eric watched as the injured man was loaded into the aircraft. The paramedics had stabilized him as much as possible, but his condition remained critical. As the helicopter lifted off, banking toward the nearest trauma center in Jackson, Eric felt the weight of the morning settle over him like a heavy coat. Patricia approached him, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk about those wolves. They didn't hurt anyone. That's not the point. They were in close proximity to an injured human. That's abnormal behavior, and it needs to be reported." Lloyd stepped in smoothly. "I'll handle the report. As I mentioned, I'm a wildlife biologist with 40 years of field experience. I've been documenting a wolf pack in this area for several weeks. What you saw was remarkable, but not dangerous." Patricia looked between them, skepticism clear on her face. "You've been documenting them?" "Through a research assistant." Lloyd gestured to Eric. "He's been living out here, conducting observations under my supervision." It wasn't exactly a lie, though Eric could see Patricia weighing the truth of it. Finally she nodded. "Fine. But I want a full report, and I want it filed with Fish and Wildlife. If those wolves are habituated, They're a management concern. They're not habituated, Eric said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. They're just not afraid. There's a difference. I hope you're right, Patricia said, because if they approach hikers or campers, someone's going to get hurt, and then those wolves will be destroyed. After the rescue team departed, hiking back toward town with their equipment, Eric and Lloyd stood alone in the clearing. The wolves were gone, melted back into the forest, as if they'd never been there. This is going to bring attention, Lloyd said quietly. Once the story gets out about how you found the victim, and it will get out, people are going to ask questions. I know. We need to get ahead of it. Control the narrative before someone else does. Lloyd pulled out his phone. I'm calling the university. My colleague, the one I mentioned before, Dr. Catherine Whitmore. She specializes in wolf behavior and interspecies communication. If anyone can help us document this properly and advocate for the pack's protection, it's her. Eric wanted to argue, to protect the privacy he'd found in this forest. But Patricia's words echoed in his mind. If those wolves approach hikers, they'll be destroyed. The only way to save them was to prove they weren't a threat, and that required proper scientific documentation. All right, Eric said. Make the call. They hiked back to Eric's camp in silence, both men processing the morning's events. When they arrived, Eric's treehouse looked exactly as he'd left it, modest, weathered, improbable, home. Lloyd made his call while Eric built a fire, needing something normal to anchor himself. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Lloyd's end filled with phrases like unprecedented behavior and unique opportunity for research, and, yes, I understand the implications. When he disconnected, Lloyd looked energized in a way Eric hadn't seen before. She's coming. Tomorrow. She's cancelling her classes and driving up from Laramie. She wants to see everything, your camp, the trail camera footage, the site where the wolves kept vigil over the victim. That fast. Eric, what happened today is the kind of thing researchers spend their entire careers hoping to witness. Wolves deliberately seeking human help for another human? That's cognitive complexity that challenges everything we think we know about animal intelligence and social behavior. Eric poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the cold air. They didn't seek human help. They sought my help. There's a difference. Exactly. Which means they've formed individual recognition and trust with you specifically. That's even more significant. They spent the rest of the day reviewing the trail camera footage and organizing Eric's journals. Lloyd helped him create a timeline of interactions, marking significant behavioral changes and patterns. By evening, they had documentation that told a clear story. 3 wolves had, over the course of 2 months, developed a cooperative relationship with a human, unlike anything in the modern scientific record. That night, Eric's phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a Jackson area code. Mr. Vance? This is Preston Garfield. I was the hiker, Eric finished. You're conscious, thanks to you. Preston's voice was weak but clear. The doctors told me you found me, that you'd been down in that ravine, that you kept me warm until help arrived. Eric thought of the alpha and female, their bodies pressed against Preston through the night, their warmth buying him hours he wouldn't have had otherwise. I had help, Eric said. They told me about the wolves, said they were lying right next to me when the rescue team arrived. Preston paused. I don't remember much, but I remember warmth, and I remember dreaming about silver eyes watching over me. I thought it was angels or hallucinations or something, but it was real, wasn't it? It was real. The news is calling you the hermit who saved my life. They want to interview you. Eric's stomach tightened. I'm not interested in interviews. I understand. But Mr. Vance, Eric, my family wants to thank you properly. And I want to tell your story, if you'll let me. What you're doing out there, living with those wolves, it's important. People need to know that humans and wildlife can coexist. that these animals aren't monsters. They're not my wolves. They're wild animals who happen to tolerate me. Even better. Look, think about it. Please. You saved my life, and now I want to help save theirs. After they disconnected, Eric sat watching the fire burn down to coals. Across the clearing, 3 sets of eyes reflected the firelight. The wolves had returned, sitting at the tree line, watching over him the way they'd watched over Preston. "This is going to get complicated, isn't it?" Eric said to them. The alpha's tail gave that single wag. Agreement, or maybe just acknowledgement, that change was coming whether Eric was ready for it or not. The next morning, Dr. Catherine Whitmore arrived. She was in her 50s, weather-worn and sharp-eyed, carrying equipment that suggested she meant business. Lloyd made introductions, and she shook Eric's hand with a grip that conveyed both respect and intensity. "Show me everything," she said. They spent 3 hours walking through Eric's documentation, reviewing footage, examining the physical evidence the antler the wolves had brought, the windbreak they'd built, the tracks that showed their daily patterns. Catherine took notes constantly, asking questions that revealed both skepticism and fascination. "This is extraordinary," she said finally, "but I need to see them. I need to observe the interaction firsthand before I can make any formal assessment." "They come most mornings around 6:15, Eric said. "Then I'll be here at 6. She was. The next morning, Catherine stood with Eric and Lloyd on the platform as dawn approached. The forest was silent, waiting. Eric felt nervous in a way he hadn't since the first week. What if the wolves didn't come? What if they sensed the additional humans and stayed away? But at 6:17, the alpha emerged from the trees. He stopped when he saw the extra people, his body going still. Behind him, the female and young male waited. "Nobody move," Catherine breathed. The alpha studied them for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he looked directly at Eric and vocalized a low sound that carried clearly across the clearing. It was a question. "Are these with you? Are they safe?" "They're okay," Eric said softly. "They're friends." The alpha held his gaze for another few seconds, then walked forward and took his usual position. The others followed. All 3 sat watching the platform, where 3 humans stood watching back. Catherine's hands shook as she raised her camera. "My God," she whispered. "They're assessing us, deciding if we're trustworthy based on their trust in you." They stayed for 15 minutes, allowing themselves to be photographed and observed. Before leaving, the alpha approached the tree more closely than usual, looked up at Eric, and gave that single tail wag. After they disappeared into the forest, Catherine turned to Eric, with tears in her eyes. "Do you understand what you have here? This isn't just trust between one human and wild animals. They're extending that trust to your pack, to us. That's cultural learning. That's teaching each other that certain humans are safe." "What does that mean?" Eric asked. "It means," Catherine said, "that we have a chance to prove something the world desperately needs to see. That coexistence is possible, that wildlife and humans don't have to be enemies." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the university dean. We need emergency research funding, protective designation for this territory, and media management before this gets out of control. Eric, like it or not, you and these wolves are about to become very famous." Eric looked out at the forest where his wolves had vanished and felt the last traces of his old life finally slip away. There was no going back now. There was only forward, into whatever came next. The story broke 3 days later, and when it did, it exploded across every news outlet in the country. "Hermit and Wolves Save Missing Hiker," read one headline. "Man Builds Treehouse, Befriends Wolf Pack, Conducts Miraculous Rescue," proclaimed another. Eric's phone, which had been blessedly quiet for 2 months, suddenly rang constantly with requests from journalists, documentary producers, and talk show hosts. He ignored all of them, except one. Preston Garfield was released from the hospital after 4 days. His leg was pinned and casted, 3 ribs were cracked, and he had a concussion that would require months of monitoring, but he was alive. Against his doctor's advice, he insisted on being driven back to Kernville. Eric met him at the diner in town, a neutral location that kept reporters at bay. Preston arrived on crutches, his wife helping him through the door. She was a slight woman with fierce eyes, and she grabbed Eric in a hug before he could react. "You saved him," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my husband." Nath. The wolves saved him," Eric corrected gently. "I just made the call." They sat in a corner booth while Preston's wife, Linda, ordered coffee for all of them. Preston looked diminished by his injuries, but very much alive, and he studied Eric with open curiosity. "Tell me about them," Preston said. "The wolves. How did this happen?" Eric found himself telling the story, the foreclosure, the retreat to the forest, that first morning when 3 wolves appeared below his treehouse. He talked about the daily visits, the gifts, the slow building of trust that defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. Preston listened intently, occasionally asking questions that suggested he understood more than Eric expected. When Eric finished, Preston was quiet for a moment. "I'm an architect," he said finally. "I design buildings that are supposed to serve people, make their lives better. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started. I was hiking alone that day because my wife had asked me when I'd last done something that wasn't about work or money or status, and I didn't have an answer." Linda reached for his hand. "I fell because I was distracted," Preston continued, "thinking about everything I'd missed while chasing things that don't matter. And then I was at the bottom of that ravine, cold and broken and certain I was going to die, but I felt warmth. I opened my eyes once and saw a wolf lying next to me, and I thought I was hallucinating. But I wasn't, was I?" "No," Eric said. "They stayed with you through the night, kept you warm enough to survive until morning." "Why would they do that?" "I don't know. Maybe because you were in their territory and they recognized you were hurt. Maybe because they've learned that humans aren't always threats. I honestly don't know." Preston leaned forward. "But you want to protect them?" "Yes." "Then let me help. My family has money, and we have connections. We can fund research, establish protective measures, make sure those wolves are safe. But more than that, we can tell this story right. Show people that wildlife isn't the enemy." Linda nodded. "Preston's Family Foundation supports conservation projects. This would be exactly the kind of initiative his parents would have wanted to fund." Over the next hour, they sketched out a plan. Preston would use his family's resources to establish a research grant through the university, funding Catherine's work and providing Eric with an official position as field researcher. They'd create a protected zone around Eric's camp, limiting public access while allowing legitimate scientific observation. And they'd work with media, carefully, controlling the narrative to protect both the wolves and Eric's privacy. "There's one more thing," Preston said as they prepared to leave. "I want to meet them, the wolves. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to see them again, to say thank you." Eric exchanged glances with Catherine, who joined them halfway through the meeting. "That's not a good idea," Catherine said. "They've accepted Eric because of months of careful interaction. Introducing new people could disrupt that relationship." "They accepted you and Lloyd," Preston pointed out, "because Eric vouched for us, essentially. And even then, it was their choice. They assessed us and decided we were acceptable. But Preston, you're the person they rescued. You represent something different in their experience. All the more reason they might recognize me." Catherine sighed. "It's possible. Wolf memory is extraordinary, but it's also risky. If they react badly, it could undo months of trust building." Eric thought about it, about the Alpha's intelligence, his ability to read situations and make decisions, about the pack's willingness to help a stranger, to seek human assistance when needed. "Let him try," Eric said. "But we do it carefully, at a distance. And if the wolves show any sign of discomfort, Preston leaves immediately. They scheduled the visit for the following morning. Eric spent the evening preparing, explaining to Preston what to expect, how to move, how to interpret wolf body language. The whole situation felt surreal 2 months ago. Eric had been a man with nothing, hiding in the forest. Now he was coordinating wolf observations with a research team and teaching interspecies communication protocols. The next morning was clear and cold. Preston arrived before dawn, moving slowly on his crutches, his wife hovering protectively. Catherine and Lloyd were already there, along with 2 graduate students Catherine had brought to document the encounter. "Remember," Eric told Preston as they positioned themselves near the treehouse, "stay still. Let them approach or not approach on their terms. Don't make eye contact initially. Wolves can interpret that as a challenge. And for God's sake, don't try to touch them." At 6:15, the wolves appeared. The alpha emerged first, as always, but he stopped immediately when he saw the group of humans. His posture shifted, alert and assessing. The female and young male flanked him, all 3 focused on Preston. Eric held his breath. This could go very wrong very quickly. Then the alpha did something Eric had never seen. He walked forward, directly toward Preston, closing the distance until he was less than 10 feet away. He stopped, lowered his head slightly, and stared at the injured man. Preston, to his credit, remained absolutely still. The alpha sniffed the air, clearly catching Preston's scent, processing it. Then, incredibly, his tail began to wag, not the single wag Eric was used to, but a full, repeated motion. Recognition. "He remembers," Catherine breathed. "He recognizes Preston from the rescue." The female approached then, moving to Preston's side, and did something that made Eric's throat tighten. She pressed her shoulder against Preston's leg, the uninjured one, in what could only be described as a gesture of connection. Preston's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving my life." The wolves stayed for 30 minutes, longer than they'd stayed with anyone except Eric. They allowed Preston to exist in their space, accepted his presence without fear or aggression. And when they finally left, walking back into the forest together, everyone present understood they'd witnessed something extraordinary. "That's it," Catherine said, reviewing the footage on her camera. "That's the evidence we need. This goes beyond habituation or curiosity. They have memory, recognition, and what appears to be compassion. They saved him, and they remember doing it." Preston wiped his eyes and looked at Eric. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes to protect them, my family is committed." Eric nodded, watching the trees where the wolves had vanished. His life had been broken open, exposed to the world. But standing here, surrounded by people who understood what these animals represented, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Spring came to the Wyoming forest with the subtlety of a whispered promise. The snow began to recede in mid-March, revealing ground that had been hidden for months. Streams swelled with snowmelt, their music filling the spaces between trees. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter, and the forest came alive with sounds Eric had almost forgotten. He stood on his platform on a morning in early April, coffee in hand, watching the world transform. The treehouse had changed too. It was still modest, still constructed from salvaged materials, but it had been reinforced and weatherproofed with supplies Preston's foundation had provided. A small solar panel now powered a laptop and better camera equipment. The structure was more permanent now, official, the headquarters of the Northern Wyoming Wolf Observation Project. The wolves arrived at 6:23, their schedule shifting with the sunrise, but there were 5 now instead of 3. The alpha and female had been joined by 2 cubs, gangly, oversized, pawed juveniles who tumbled over each other in play while their parents watched with what Eric could only describe as patient amusement. "Good morning," Eric called down softly. The alpha looked up, his scarred muzzle grey in the morning light, and gave that familiar single wag of his tail. The female was teaching the cubs to sit, positioning them with gentle nudges of her nose. The young male from last fall, nearly full-grown, now sat apart, watching the cubs with the expression of an older sibling tolerating younger ones. Eric documented it all in his journal, now supplemented by Catherine's rigorous data collection protocols. Every behavior, every interaction was recorded and analyzed. The research they were conducting had attracted attention from universities worldwide. Papers were being written, grants were being funded. A documentary crew had spent 2 weeks filming last month, capturing footage that would premiere at a wildlife film festival in the fall. But for Eric, the core remained simple. Each morning, the wolves came. Each morning, he was here to witness them. His phone buzzed a text from Vanessa. "Landing in Jackson at 2 p.m. Can't wait to see you and meet your wolves." She'd visited twice since winter, each time staying longer, helping with research, documentation, and learning about wildlife conservation. The experience had crystallized something for her, and last month she'd enrolled in an environmental science program at the University of Wyoming. She'd be starting in the fall, close enough to visit regularly. "Your daughter's coming again?" Lloyd's voice called from below. Eric looked down to see the older man hiking into camp, pack on his shoulders. Lloyd visited several times a week now, helping coordinate the research project he'd officially become co-director of. He'd retired from the hardware store, devoting himself full-time to the work that had rekindled his passion for field biology. This afternoon, she's bringing her new boyfriend, some guy she met at an environmental activism event in Seattle. Lloyd laughed, climbing the rope ladder with practiced ease. "Your life has gotten complicated." "In the best way," Eric admitted. They spent the morning reviewing data, preparing for Catherine's visit next week. The research was yielding remarkable findings. The pack's social structure, their problem-solving abilities, their capacity for individual recognition and memory, all of it was challenging existing scientific understanding of wolf cognition and behavior. But the most significant finding was simpler. Wolves and humans could coexist peacefully, even cooperatively, given mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. The pack had never shown aggression toward any of the researchers or approved visitors. They'd learned to distinguish between people they knew and strangers, adjusting their behavior accordingly. "Preston called yesterday," Lloyd said. "The wildlife retreat construction is ahead of schedule. They'll break ground on the visitor center next month." The retreat was Preston's vision, a protected area adjacent to the forest where people could learn about wolves and conservation without disturbing the wild population. It would provide jobs for Kernville, education for visitors, and a buffer zone protecting the pack's territory. Preston had thrown himself into the project with the fervor of someone who'd found purpose after nearly losing everything. Eric understood that completely. At noon, Eric drove to Jackson to pick up Vanessa. She emerged from the small terminal looking sun-bronzed and confident, a young man beside her carrying camping gear. They'd planned to stay at Eric's camp for 3 days, hoping to observe the wolves and help with data collection. "Dad," Vanessa hugged him hard, "you look good, really good." Eric studied his reflection in the truck window. She was right. The gauntness of last fall had filled out into something healthier. His beard was full and grey, his skin weathered but his eyes clear. He looked like someone who spent their days outdoors doing work they believed in. He looked, he realized, like his father had in those old camping trip photos. "This is Trey," Vanessa said, introducing her boyfriend. "He's studying renewable energy systems." They shook hands, and Eric saw in the young man's eyes the same kind of earnest determination Vanessa had developed. They'd found each other through shared values, through wanting to make the world better. That mattered more than any career credential. The drive back to camp was filled with Vanessa's chatter about her plans, her excitement about starting school, her nervousness about meeting the wolves. Eric listened, offering occasional comments, feeling a contentment he couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. That evening they sat around the campfire, Eric, Vanessa, Trey, Lloyd, and Catherine, who'd arrived unexpectedly with fresh supplies and news about a National Geographic article featuring their research. The wolves appeared at dusk, all 5 of them, and sat at the clearing's edge, watching the humans gather. "They're beautiful," Vanessa whispered. "They are," Eric agreed. The alpha stood and walked closer, stopping at the boundary he'd established months ago, close enough to observe clearly, far enough to maintain wild dignity. He looked at Eric with those amber eyes that had witnessed so much, that had somehow decided a broken man in a treehouse was worth protecting. Eric raised his coffee mug in silent salute. The alpha's tail wagged once, then he turned and led his family back into the darkening forest. "Do you ever think about going back?" Vanessa asked later, as they sat watching the fire burn low. "To the city? To normal life?" Eric looked around at his camp, at the treehouse that had started as desperate shelter and become home. He thought about his daily routine, the research that gave him purpose, the wolves who had saved him by letting him save himself. "I am back," he said. "This is normal now. This is life." Helen called the next morning, her voice warm across the distance. They talked regularly now, not as former spouses, but as people who'd shared history and maintained respect. "Vanessa says you're thriving," Helen said. "I suppose I am. I'm glad, Eric, I really am. What you're doing matters." After they disconnected, Eric climbed onto his platform and pulled out the brass compass his father had given him. The glass was still cracked, the casing still tarnished, but the needle pointed true north, unwavering. He'd spent so much of his life feeling lost, following paths other people said were right, building a life that looked successful from outside, but felt hollow within. The foreclosure, the loss, the retreat to this forest, all of it had felt like failure. But it hadn't been failure. It had been finding true north. The wolves had taught him that. Not through words or human wisdom, but through their simple presence. By showing up each day, by accepting him without judgment, by demonstrating that worth wasn't measured in houses owned or salaries earned, but in the honest living of each moment. Eric had lost everything, his house, his savings, his sense of purpose, and in losing it, he'd found what actually mattered. The forest stretched in every direction, green with new growth, alive with possibility. Somewhere in those trees, 3 adult wolves and 2 cubs were living their lives, hunting and playing and existing in the eternal present that animals understood instinctively. And here, in a treehouse built from salvaged wood and determination, a 50-year-old man who'd once believed he was finished had discovered he was just beginning. The compass needle held steady, pointing north. Eric smiled, closed the compass, and went to make breakfast. The wolves would be arriving soon, and he wanted to be ready. There was work to do, research to conduct, a future to build from the remnants of what he'd lost. He was exactly where he belonged.